Side 2. Chapter 3. The dog wakened him by licking his face. He had no idea what time it was, but all along the gap between the boat and the sand, the sun was shining. The dog dug its way out with great enthusiasm, showering him with sand, bringing him fully awake. He scrambled out after it. It was a glorious morning. The sky was blue from horizon to horizon. Little wavelets crept up the beach, gentle as a kiss. The air was still cool, and the sun had just risen over the sea, and there wasn't a soul in sight. His first thought was that he must get clean. He stripped to his underpants, shivering, and walked out into the wavelets. He remembered learning at school that you could get yourself clean with sand, and picked up a handful of liquid sand and scrubbed his hands. He did it 3 times, and it worked. All the grime vanished, leaving his hands pale and wrinkled with the cold. He got another handful and scrubbed his face. The sand stung, but in a pleasant way. His mouth filled with a salty taste, but that was all right. He remembered also from school that you could clean your teeth with salt, and he cleaned them with a bit of sand on his finger and spat out. Then he scrubbed himself with sand all over. He felt great, really alive. He wanted to swim, but he didn't want to get his underpants soaking. Then he thought that the sun would dry them as it had once dried his swimming costume, and plunged in regardless. The sea was much warmer than the air. He swam and swam. He loved swimming. He imagined he was a fish without a care in the world. Then he looked up and saw the dog's face swimming in front of him. The dog also looked terribly happy and was carrying a crooked black stick in his mouth. It dropped it in the water in front of him. It wanted it thrown. He tried to stand up in the water, found he was too far out when his head went under, and scrambled back to the shore in a flurry of arms and legs and foam. But he wasn't really worried. This was the haven, and his dad had always said that the haven was safe. No undertow, no currents, safest place in Northumberland. When he found his footing, the dog brought him the stick again, and he spent ages throwing it out to sea. He thought the dog would never tire, but eventually it ran up the beach, dived under the boat, and emerged with a newspaper packet in its mouth. Last night's spare sausage and chips. He yelled at it, suddenly furious. He was in charge, the dog was getting above itself. He tried to grab the packet from its mouth, but it wouldn't let go, shaking its head to throw off his hand and backing away all the time. Beside himself with rage, he hit it with the crooked black stick that he still held in his other hand. It closed its eyes, but it wouldn't let go. He hit it harder, and it growled deep in its throat. Perhaps it was lucky that the stick broke. He put both hands to the packet of newspaper and pulled with all his might. The newspaper tore on the dog's teeth, and he had it. The dog made a snatch for it, but he held it high in the air. The dog leapt and knocked him flat, but he kept hold of the packet, clutching it into his armpit as he fell like a rugby ball at school. The dog kept nosing in, but he twisted and turned. Several times he felt the dog's naked teeth touch his skin, but the dog didn't bite him. At last they stopped and glared at each other. He couldn't read the look on the dog's face, but he wasn't scared of dogs. He would show it who was boss. "Sit, boy! Sit!" It sat at last, tail swishing vigorously. He began to unwrap the packet, and it dived in again. He hit it on the nose, and it backed off. The battle seemed to go on forever, but at last the dog learned to sit still until he had unwrapped the whole packet and laid out its share. Then it dived in, without waiting for the word of command. He sat back with a sigh and ate his own. It was a victory of sorts. He ate his sausage, which tasted good. He thought the chips would be awful, but they tasted good as well. When he had finished, he looked down at his bare stomach. It was bulging, but it felt good and solid and cheering, and his underpants, though sandy, were nearly dry. And now the sun touched warmly on his back, and he came out in goose pimples. He looked all round, cautiously. There was still nobody about, though there was smoke coming from the chimney at one of the coastguard cottages on the headland. He thought he had time for a quick explore along the tide line, where you always found the interesting things. The dog thought that was great. It began pouncing on all the patches of seaweed, killing them with its feet, dive-bombing them, then throwing them high in the air. He tried calling it to heel, as he'd seen men do when they were walking their dogs on the beach. It ignored him. He made up his mind to work on it. Its disobedience could get them both into trouble. It was then that he found a lump of soaking rope. He tried it for strength, stamping on one end and pulling the other end with both hands. It seemed pretty strong, and it was only a metre long with frayed ends. He knew there was no point in calling the dog, but he waved the rope enticingly, and the dog came, and he grabbed its collar and slipped the rope through. The dog promptly took off along the beach, dragging him after it. It was stronger than he was, and heavier. All he could do was hang on. The dog made terrible noises, like it was choking itself to death, but he hung on. He had to win, for both their sakes. It was a good dog, but only young. It had to learn. Finally, it got tired of strangling itself and walked quietly by his side. It was then he found the other useful thing, a washing day ladle like Mam used, about 8 inches across, rusty, but it had no holes in it. It would do to give the dog water in. He came back to the boat full of triumph and got dressed. As he did, 2 more pennies fell out of his trouser pocket. He searched every pocket after that and ended up with threepence halfpenny. He stared at it, lying in the pale palm of his hand, and despair fell on him without warning out of a clear blue sky like a collapsing house. What good was threepence halfpenny? It wouldn't even buy them a meal to share tonight. Only chips, and when the chips were gone, what then? And the next day and the next, getting hungrier and hungrier. He could only get food by going to Cousin Elsie's, and he knew what Uncle George would do with the dog, straight down to the police station. He stared at the sand for a long, long time. The dog, puzzled, impatient, leapt up and put its paws on his shoulders and looked at him trustingly. He could have died of agony. And then he remembered his father's voice again. "Don't flap around like a wet hen. Think!" And immediately he realised he did have some money. In the trustee savings bank, £17 10 shillings. All the money from all the birthdays and Christmases that Mam had made him save when he'd wanted to go out and spend it. Saving up for a rainy day, she'd call it, when he'd raged and pleaded with her. But where was the bank book? In the attaché case, of course. He dived in under the boat and clicked open the case with trembling hands. There was a bundle of bank books, held together neatly by an elastic band. Dad's on top, then Mam's, then his. He opened it. It said in neat curling writing, £17 10 shillings. And he knew how to get it out. He only had to fill in a form, that was all. He had enough now to keep himself and the dog for months. Wild excitement blew through him like a gale. He must get it, now! Then his eye drifted round the rest of the case, over the other precious things it contained. Dad's best wristwatch, the one he only used for special occasions in case it got scratched. The bright pink insurance books, a wedding photograph in a small silver frame with Mam and Dad looking smooth, smiling and young. His own photograph in school uniform from when he first went to the grammar school. A neat bundle of school reports. How proud of him they'd been. Tears pricked again, so he rushed on, being practical. The family ration books, a bar of Mam's pongy special toilet soap still in its paper wrapper. The scent wafted up to his nostrils, and he felt suddenly terribly guilty, as if he was burgling a church. He was never allowed to look inside the attaché case. It was private to Mam and Dad. He took his own bank book and then slammed the case shut and clicked in the fasteners loudly. Well, as long as he carried the attaché case, Mam and Dad would still be with him, like the Ark of the Covenant that the children of Israel carried all the way to the Promised Land. To soothe himself, he carefully folded the blankets into a neat heap, then came out of the boat and smoothed down the sand to hide the entrance, and sat playing with the dog's ears till his breathing came back to normal. Not a moment too soon. There was a man coming out of the Coast Guard cottage, the one with the smoking chimney, walking down the beach towards him. Harry could tell from the way he walked that he wasn't a bad bloke. He walked slow and steady and contented, puffing on his pipe, stopping to look at things and touch them. Only a bit bossy, perhaps, as if it was his place. "Good morning, young fella, me lad. You're the early bird that catches the worm." "Been swimming?" said Harry. "So I noticed while I was shaving. Said to the missus, there's a young fellow, me lad, having a grand time with his dog on a Saturday morning early." "Grand dog?" He bent and patted it. "What's his name?" "Don." The man looked for a name medal on the collar and didn't find any. "Dog could do with combing. Sand'll not do his coat no good." "I always comb him when I get home." Harry was amazed how neatly the lie popped out. Then he said, "What time is it, mister?" "8:30. said the man, pulling out a pocket watch. "Better be on me way up yonder." He pointed to the Coast Guard station on the cliff. "Just thought I'd have a word with you, seeing you was having so much fun with your dog. Only," he added, "you could do with your pair of bathing trunks instead of bathing in your underpants. We'll have young girls down here later on." He glanced around. "And a towel wouldn't do any harm either." Harry glanced at him, suddenly hunched up, wary. But the man gave him a conspiratorial grin. "I didn't tell my mum all I was doing when I was young either." And he was gone, leaving only a fragrant whiff of his tobacco smoke. Chapter 4. 3 hours later, Harry lay back on the sand by the boat, closed his eyes and let his mind stop whirling. What a terrible trip. He was never going up into the town again. Tommy Dodds had seen him, and Audrey Henry's mother, and he'd only missed running into Cousin Elsie by diving up a back alley like a shot rabbit. He still wasn't sure she hadn't seen him. And the terrible wait in the bank while the man counted out his money 3 times before he gave it to him. And he'd worried about Don tied to a lamppost outside. When he'd got out, he took the bus straight back to Tynemouth. Thank God he'd had that threepence halfpenny, or he'd have had to give the conductor a 10-shilling note for the fare, and the conductor had still fussed about how Sandy the dog was, and how it was making a mess of his bus. It had been stupid to go into the town on a Saturday, when everybody was out shopping. If he went on making stupid mistakes like that, he'd get caught for certain. But Tynemouth village had been better. Nobody knew him in Tynemouth, and he'd had a good shopping spree, 10-shilling notes or no 10-shilling notes. There were still things to buy that were not on the rations. The pet shop woman had been nice and friendly, sold him a leash for the dog and a steel curry comb, and a big bag of dog biscuits, and some anti-flea soap that would do for them both. She'd pursed her lips over the note, but he'd said, "It's me birthday present," and she'd told him that he was a kind boy, spending all his birthday present on his dog. Then he'd gone to the butcher's and got some bones for the dog, and looked at the Cornish pasties so hungrily that the man had said with a grin, "Do you want one? You cannot live on doggy bones, a growing lad like you." And lastly, he'd gone to the newsagents and bought 2 boxes of matches because he thought they were sure to come in useful, and the biggest newspaper he could see. Not that he cared a damn about the news, but certain movements in his tummy told him he was going to need a newspaper tonight after dark. God, life was all food going in one end and out the other. But for the moment he was content, full of Cornish pasty, watching the dog chew at his big bone and watching the girls go past in their bathing costumes, through the pair of dark glasses that he'd thought on to buy at the chemist's. The chip shop man saw him coming, long before he got to the shop. Harry could see the bald head peering and bobbing maliciously over the heads of the customers. He'd spent half the day manufacturing lies for the chip shop man. He tied up Don properly by his leash to the lamppost and pushed boldly into the shop. "Ha!" said the man nastily. "Here's our little war hero, back for his nightly share of our fish and chips. And I see you've managed to wash your face for once." Harry joined the queue quietly, saying nothing. All the people in the shop were total strangers, so he knew he couldn't look for any help there. "He's bombed out, you know," said the man nastily. "Where you billeted, then?" Harry was ready. "Priory Road." It was the longest road in Tynemouth and not very posh. "What number?" asked the man. Harry was ready for that too. "Dunno," he said. "But it's about halfway down on the right-hand side. Got a green door and big white seashells in the garden." Half the houses in Priory Road had big white seashells in the garden. "What's the lady's name that you billeted on?" It's a funny long name. We'd just have to call her Auntie." There was a titter in the queue. Harry felt they were turning onto his side. The woman at the front of the queue said sharply, "Come on, Jim, I haven't got all night to stand here, you know. Our turn's got to go back from leave." The man gave Harry another nasty glare, but started shoveling chips again. Meanwhile, the other women in the queue began discussing which woman with a funny long name had a house in Priory Road, with a green door and seashells in the front garden. "It's not Peggy Molyneux, is it? I hadn't heard she had anybody billeted on her." Harry was glad he'd picked the longest road in Tynemouth, but he knew with dreadful certainty that this was the last time he could use the chip shop. The gossip would be all over the village by tomorrow night, and what would he and Don do for food then? The woman asked him more questions about his landlady, and he almost ran out of answers and sweated. But at last it was his turn. "6 sausage and chips, please." He might as well grab what food he could. "6?" yelled the man. "Are you feeding a bloody regiment or something? The landlady wants some and all, and for a husband." Harry's lips quivered. He felt a traitorous tear gathering in his eye and simply let himself cry. It had worked last night. "Oh, leave the poor Ben alone, for God's sake," said a woman. "What's he ever done to you, Jim?" And there was a murmur from the queue. Harry didn't think anybody liked the man, really. But it was a marvellous relief to get out into the cool air of Front Street, with the packet burning against his chest. His tears dried up instantly, and he untied Don and walked down to the sea, amazed at himself. His dad had always taught him never to lie, and that only babies cried. But tears and lies seemed to be all that worked now. In the night, the dog stirred against his side, stirred and growled deep in its throat. Harry was awake in a flash. Was there someone prowling the dark beach? Somebody after Mam's precious attaché case? He listened hard and heard nothing. Then the dog growled again, and Harry heard... out over the sea. The Jerry bombers were back, and there seemed to be a lot of them. Then on the castle cliffs overhead the siren went. The dog whimpered once, and then went mad, trying to scrabble its way out from under the boat, casting huge sheets of sand over the blankets and into Harry's eyes in the dark. His eyes were agony. But he knew he must stop the dog. Dogs went crazy in air raids, ran about the streets howling, upsetting people, ran blind, ran anywhere. Don could run off and get lost forever. He grabbed for Don's collar and felt around desperately for the leash and got it on him just as the dog wriggled out from under the boat. Harry let himself be dragged after him, bumping his head so he saw stars. There was nothing else he could do. Outside it was as light as day. 3 searchlights, 3 great bars of blue light reached outwards from the castle into the sky above the sea, slowly waving and feeling like fingers for the approaching Jerrys. More searchlights waved around from South Shields across the river. Little bits of mist or cloud drifted through the beams like cigarette smoke. By the light, Harry could see every detail of the beach, and be seen. There'd be a warden round in a minute, yelling at him to get under cover, and the bombers were closer and the guns would be opening fire overhead. Where to run to? But the dog just ran, and Harry had to run with him, tripping over bits of wood half buried in the sand, and once falling flat and being dragged along. He hadn't a clue where he was going, but Don had. Suddenly, they were up against the beginning of the pier, the massive granite pier, and set into the pier huge arches. And inside the arches, massive granite blocks were stored for repairing the pier when the waves broke it. Don went straight into a dark gap between the blocks and dragged Harry after him. And then Don stopped, and Harry realised he was in the best air raid shelter in Tynemouth. 6 feet of granite over his head, and solid granite on 3 sides, and on the 4th, a parapet of huge blocks just low enough to peer over. "Good dog," he whispered. "Good dog," and fondled the dog's ears. Don was shaking so hard he made Harry shake in sympathy. Harry remembered something his dad had said about dogs in air raids. They suffered terribly with their ears because they could hear 10 times better than people. The sounds were 10 times as loud to them. He pulled off one of his jumpers, folded down the dog's ears, and wrapped the jumper around them hard. The dog seemed to like it. It snuggled in. And then the castle guns fired, and it was like the end of the world. The world cracked apart 4 times. Harry's head seemed to crack apart 4 times. His ears hurt, physically hurt, like earache. He remembered the government issuing earplugs. Everyone had laughed at the idea of the little rubber earplugs on their bit of string that you carried in your gas mask case, if you still carried your gas mask case, which hardly anyone ever did these days, only kids with soppy mams. He wished he had them now. But something. Hold the dog with one hand, scrabble in his pockets with the other. Bit of paper, bus ticket. He shoved it into his mouth and chewed it frantically. When it was soggy enough, he worked it into 2 lumps and pushed one piece into each of his ears. The castle guns fired again, but it was much better now, only half as bad, didn't hurt. He shoved the bits of bus ticket even further in, then peered with interest over his high bulwark. He'd never been out in an air raid before. He'd always been cowering down the shelter like a rat in a hole. Mam hadn't even let him look out of the shelter door, unless it had been quiet for ages. He thought it was the grandest firework display he'd ever seen. High above, great chains of blue lights hung, lighting the whole sky. They swung, they drifted across each other like swathes of stars. These must be the chandeliers Dad had talked about, dropped by the bombers to light their target. The ack-ack men at South Shields must be trying to shoot them out. Long streams of tracer shells, yellow and red, climbed slowly into the sky from behind South Shields Pier. They made the blue lights rock and swing harder, but they didn't put them out. Then the Castle guns fired again, making Don flinch, making a pattern of 4 bright stars in the sky that burnt holes in your eyes, so that wherever you looked afterwards there were 4 black holes in what you looked at. And it all smelt like Guy Fawkes night. It was grand. Grand like a thunderstorm if you were out in it and not afraid of being hit by lightning. It made Harry feel huge as the sky. And then he saw the German bomber, clear and sharp as a minnow in a pond, caught in a cone of no less than 5 searchlights. It wriggled, glistened like a minnow with a shiny nose and tiny crosses on its wings, a minnow trying to escape out of a giant hand. But the giant hand of light held it, twist and turn though it might. Then every gun on Tyneside seemed to be firing at it. Again and again it vanished in the scatters of blinding flashes. Harry's eyes seemed as full of black holes as Mam's colander. But when the flashes had gone, the tiny plane was still there, twisting and turning and getting bigger. It didn't seem to be going anywhere anymore, just wriggling, trying to escape. And then there was a streak of fire, then a comet, a shooting star of brilliant yellow heading out to sea, down to the sea. Down and down and down, brighter and brighter and brighter, better than a 2-shilling rocket. And then it burst into a brilliant shower of blue lights that were caught by the wind and drifted and went out, all but one that glowed all the way down to the dark water. The guns were silent, so you heard the hiss it made as it hit the sea, heard the people cheering all the way over the dark water in South Shields. He hugged the dog. "We got one, boy, we got one!" It was better than North Shields football team scoring a goal. In the silence, the dog thumped its tail against his leg and licked his hand. And then the next wave of Jerrys came vrooming in. It was dawn before the Jerry stopped coming and the all clear went. He and the dog came out of their deep, deep shelter. The dog stretched fore and aft, sniffed an upturned boat and peed against it. Harry, walking on what felt like 2 wooden legs, watched it with great fondness. Don was wonderful. He'd heard the bombers coming, long before the sirens went. He'd found the best shelter. Above all, he'd been close to the dog, to its furry, warm bulk. The dog had been closer to him than Mam had been, let alone Dad. He thought he and the dog made a pretty good team. He sat on his upturned boat and watched the dog sniffing around the beach. Nice to sit in peace and quiet, listening to the little waves plopping on the sand after the great storm of the night. But today, Sunday, they had to move on, before someone noticed him on the beach on Monday morning and caught him as a truant from school, before the food ran out, before the dog went through again what he'd gone through last night. Away, up the coast, to where there were no people to bother them, to where there was plenty of food. He knew he wasn't thinking very straight. He needed more sleep. He called to the dog, lured it to him with its share of cold sausage and chips, then got it through the hole under the boat, and in a little while they were both sound asleep. Chapter 5. He started awake and pushed back the blankets. He was very hot and there was a smell of melting tar, and worst of all, voices all around him, and the dog was gone. He must have slept too long. It was Sunday afternoon. On Sunday morning the beach was empty except for a few men walking their dogs, but on Sunday afternoons in summer, even in wartime, it filled up with families out for the day. People were sitting with their backs up against his boat, blocking out the strip of sunshine. Until they went home, he was trapped, and they usually didn't go home till about 6 o'clock. And where was the dog? He could see the place where it had scrabbled out. How long had it been gone? Where had it gone? Had it gone for good? There was nothing he could do. He couldn't scramble out after it, in full view of everybody. It wasn't that he was afraid of the people sitting round, it was more a terrible embarrassment at making a fool of himself, of being stared at when he was all dirty and sweaty and peculiar looking. And his cousin Elsie or somebody else he knew might be sitting there. All he could do was push back the blankets and lie there and munch another soggy mass of cold chips and worry about the dog. It was more horrible than being in the shelter during an air raid. It was the voices that soothed him in the end. The family sitting against the boat at least were strangers. A mum and dad, 3 kids and a granny. They had rough accents. They must come from further up the river, somewhere like Byker. When the granny said, "I've lived in Byker all my life. I've never seen anything like that in all my born days," it cheered him slightly that he'd guessed right. He sort of lost himself in the life of the family. Bossy mum, idle dad. "Why don't you play cricket with the bairns, George? The boat's stiff." "Why, there's no room to play cricket, Hinny. There's not room to swing a cat. Don Bradman himself couldn't play cricket here. But do something with them. Woman, I've slaved 6 days a week at the North Eastern Marine, and even God rested on the 7th day." There's our Edith throwing sand in Sammy's eyes again. "Stop it, our Edith, or you'll feel the back of my hand." "Can't you get them an ice cream, George? I could do with one myself." "Ice cream, Henny? There's a one. There's a fella at the top of the bank." "Bloody Italian black marketeer. You don't know what they put in them things. Vaseline and hair cream, anything else they can lay their hands on. Would poison a dog." "Ma'am, tell our Edith to stop it." "Our Edith!" It was like going back into another life. And soon there was some good news. "Ma'am, this dog's lost. It's starving." Look, it's putting its paw up, asking, it's begging." "Get away, Alsatians can't beg, they're too big." "It's hungry. Give it that piece of pie Gran dropped in the sand." "Oh, here you are then. Anything for peace. Do you think that dog's lost, George?" Harry tensed up with terror. "No, it's not lost, Hinny. It's got a collar. It's just on the kedge. I'll watch it cadging off people for the last hour. Staying our eat. Whoever starves will not be that dog. Come here, boy. Yeah, have a sandwich. Best spam. Get it away. I don't like Alsatians, they're savage." "About as savage as a newborn lamb, look. He's rolling over to have his tummy tickled." Harry listened for a little while longer to the dog cadging food around the beach. It struck him that Don had more talents than he'd imagined. Don was indeed doing all right. Then he dozed off again. He could just sleep and sleep these days. Must be the heat. He was wakened by the dog's wet nose nudging him forcefully in the neck. He came to with a start, worrying about the people. But there was silence outside. When he peered out, the beach was empty. It was later than he wanted it to be. The sun was already dropping towards the cliff top. Night was coming, and with the night, the bombers. He packed up quickly, shaking the sand out of the blankets. But he took time to wash his face and hands with the anti-flea soap. He had to have a clean face. The water freshened him up. He was busting to go to the toilet, but he held out till he got to the toilet by the bus station. There was a bus in, going up the coast to Blythe, and he found he had plenty of loose change in his pocket. The driver and conductor had got out to have a smoke under the clock tower, so he had time to get Don nicely settled on a tight lead before the conductor dimped his fag and came aboard. "Where to, young fella, me lad?" "Single, all the way," Harry said vaguely. "Fourpence." The man handed him his ticket and eyed his luggage. "Been out for the day?" "On the beach, camping." "By God, it's grand to be young." The man left him and went to tend the passengers upstairs. The bus started and swung out round the clock tower. Harry's heart gave a sudden lurch. He was glad to get away from the bombers and from anybody who might recognise him. But this was home for the last time. There was Bertorelli's, where they'd come down on a Saturday night for an ice cream, even in the depths of winter. And then back home by bus to hear Inspector Hornley Investigates on the radio. He was off for postures new. He swallowed several times and took a firm grip on Don's collar. End of side 2.